Dear friends, welcome to my channel. This is Taras BEREZOVETS with you. May 15th could become another key date in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Yes, of course, this is not yet the climax, we have not reached it yet, but this date could become pivotal. In terms of whether direct talks between Ukrainian President Zelensky and the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin actually take place in Istanbul. In addition, there is still intrigue surrounding the question of whether the American leader Donald Trump will appear at these negotiations, as he has just begun his Middle Eastern tour, visiting 3 countries that are key allies of the United States, our machetus in the region. We are talking about Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Already during his meeting with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince bin Salman, Trump once again made it clear that he has not yet made a final decision for himself on whether he will fly to Istanbul this week or not. However, despite his busy schedule, this possibility still remains. President Zelensky and his entourage have made it clear that the Ukrainian leader will only come to Istanbul and hold negotiations if, of course, the Russian dictator is also present there. At the same time, Dmitry Peskov today gave grounds for speculation, by avoiding a direct answer regarding whether the Putin will come to Istanbul or not. Such a possibility, although it is minimal, still remains. And most importantly, the composition of the Russian delegation that plans to go to Istanbul is already almost known. This leak was provided by a number of Russian Telegram channels. Of course, we're talking about the well-known duo of Russian politicians, the Minister of Foreign Affairs Sergei Lavrov and Putin's longtime advisor, veteran of Soviet era diplomacy Yuri Ushakov, for whom a plane is already being prepared for departure. Well, friends, we'll talk about all this and more next. So, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, is ready to fly to Istanbul and is prepared to meet there only with the dictator Vladimir Putin. This was reported today by the advisor to the president's office, Mikhailo Podolyak, in a comment to the breakfast. No show. In addition, he stated that none of the other representatives of the Russian foreign policy team who previously conducted negotiations, including in 2022 with the Ukrainian delegation in Turkey, are acceptable to Zelensky. This includes the Russian politician of Ukrainian origin, Vladimir Medinsky, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, or Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin. Naturally, none of the none of them will satisfy Zelensky. In other words, only Putin can make the decision to continue or end the war, but it is definitely not Medinsky, Lavrov, Shoigu, or anyone else, Podolyak stated. Donald Trump himself, who has begun his Middle East tour that will conclude on Friday, has not ruled out the possibility of stopping by Istanbul on his way, especially since he is already in the region. All the key members of his foreign policy team are here. This includes Marco Rubio, who is accompanying Trump, as well as Kitty Kellogg and Steve Witkoff, who, according to Reuters, will travel to Turkey, where they will be present during the Ukrainian-Russian negotiations, if, of course, they take place. In an interview with journalists during a conversation at the White House, Trump said, "I think there could be a good outcome from the meeting on Thursday in Turkey between Russia and Ukraine. I thought about flying there. I don't know where I'll be on Thursday. I have so many meetings, but I thought about going there. It's a possibility. I think that if I believe something can happen, then we should do it." As always, it was said in a convoluted, very complicated, very confusing Trump-like manner. But if you extract the main point, says Trump does not rule out the possibility for himself, being a person who loves improvisation, including in foreign policy, which he pursues actively and with obvious pleasure. He certainly does not rule out the possibility that he might change his plans and cancel a number of already scheduled meetings in the Middle East to urgently fly to Istanbul. But I repeat once again, under one single condition, if of course Zelensky and Putin are going to meet there. Trump is visiting 3 key countries in the region. He has already arrived and met in the Saudi Arabian capital, Riyadh, with the head of the kingdom, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. In the photos from this first meeting, they are sitting together. He's at King Khalid International Airport in Riyadh. And Trump is calmly sipping Turkish coffee from a small cup. In addition, this is a major trip for representatives of the largest American businesses, representatives from Citigroup, IBM, Qualcomm, Alphabet, and Franklin. Templeton will participate in the Saudi American Investment Forum. The United States Poteni also plans to sell more than 100 billion dollars worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. After that speech, Trump will travel to Qatar and will conclude his trip on Friday by visiting the United Arab Emirates. All of these countries are the United States' largest foreign policy and economic partners in the region, and naturally the biggest buyers of American weapons. Accompanying Trump on his trip to the Middle East are Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Special Representative for the Middle East Steve Witkoff, of course, who else, and the controversial Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. The main stated goal of Trump's trip to the Middle East is to attract additional investment into the American economy, particularly from the two super wealthy or multi-billion-dollar sovereign wealth funds of the Persian Gulf countries. Trump needs this against the backdrop of the trade war he has initiated in order to demonstrate to American voters, let's put it this way, the continuity and consistency of his policy. Among some of the many guests listed for these VIP luncheons is, among others, the controversial Trump advisor and billionaire Elon Musk. The trip to the three largest and wealthiest countries of the Persian Gulf is also needed first and foremost to further strengthen the position of the United States in the region, as well as to secure their continued support for the State of Israel, the key U.S. ally in the region, against the backdrop of renewed tensions between Israel and Iran. And as CNN reports, this is literally breaking news, the possible visit of Trump to Istanbul, where possibly Russian-Ukrainian negotiations may take place, I emphasize may take place, remains an open question. And Trump's decision, naturally, will depend entirely on whether Putin and Zelensky end up coming to Istanbul or not. Everything is very dynamic right now. No one knows much, said a high-ranking representative of the White House administration. Nevertheless, CNN emphasized that Trump's statement that he might fly to Istanbul put significant pressure on the Kremlin and on Putin personally. I don't know what kind of pressure it put on the Kremlin, especially considering that the so-called nuclear sanctions Kaisas announced the day before by the European Union, believe it or not, never actually happened. They didn't happen primarily because now the European Union, which had previously issued an ultimatum to Putin to respond regarding a ceasefire by midnight on Tuesday, needed an answer from him. Naturally, there was no response. Now the European Union is saying that they will wait for Trump's decision. And the outcome of those very negotiations in Istanbul, which I'll repeat once again, it's still unclear whether they will actually take place or not. But it's unknown whether Trump will even show up. For now, everything is hanging by a thread, and let's be honest, the chances of this happening are negligible. There are just too many ifs in this situation. According to Reuters, Trump has chosen two members of his team who will go to Istanbul for the Ukraine-Russia negotiations. These are people you would probably least expect to see together. They are retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, Special Representative for Ukraine, and Steve Witkoff, Trump's Special Representative for the Middle East. Why is that? These two people are not compatible, not because of, say, some everyday disagreements, but primarily because of the sharp conflict between the approaches that Keith Kellogg and Steve Witkoff each adhere to. I have talked about this many times. Well, let me remind you, the point is that Keith Kellogg believes the Kremlin needs to be put under strong pressure and forced to make compromises. Steve Witkoff, on the contrary, takes the position that Putin and his demands should be satisfied as much as possible. Give him 5 regions that he hasn't even occupied, naturally refuse Ukraine's entry into NATO, accept a bunch of other things, basically fulfill Putin's wishes on nations. In this way, according to Steve Witkoff, it will be possible to bring the two countries' positions closer together and reach an agreement on everything. But as we can see, Keith Kellogg, who for a while fell out of favor with Trump. Let me remind you, his mandate was reduced. Initially, he was appointed as the special representative for Ukraine and Russia. Then that was reduced. Russia was dropped and he remained only as the special representative for Ukraine. Keith Kellogg was excluded from the American delegation at the negotiations in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, and Steve Witkoff went. Well, of course, one could say that this is logical since Kellogg is not the special representative for Ukraine, but only, for Russia, and is actually the special representative for Ukraine. But then the question arises, what was Steve Witkoff doing at the negotiations with the Russians if he is the special representative for the Middle East? But Keith Kellogg, it must be said, has recently made up for his previous loss and managed to regain Donald Trump's trust. We don't know all the details, but obviously this happened, among other things, due to Michael Waltz's resignation from the position of National Security Advisor. Now, as is known, a unique situation has arisen. There is no separate National Security Advisor in the White House, as there should be. This position is now being combined with that of Secretary of State by Marco Rubio. Let me remind you, this has happened only once before in American history, and the person who held both positions was none other than Mr. Kissinger in the 1970s. It was he who managed to combine the two posts, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. Now there is a second precedent with Marco Rubio. And by the way, it's not certain that Trump will be in a hurry to appoint someone to this position. Marco Rubio may hold both positions for quite a long time, at least for several months or even more than a year. So Marco Rubio, Keith Kellogg, and Waltz were and remain representatives of the same team. And clearly, Witkoff failed somewhere from Trump's point of view, couldn't live up to his expectations, and that's why Kipkovich regained favor. For us, this is certainly good news, especially considering the hardline stance the retired Lieutenant General takes toward the Kremlin. And now these two who can't stand each other will nevertheless form a diplomatic tandem that will represent the US in Istanbul. And once again, I repeat, Donald Trump might also show up there with his entire entourage, which includes Marco Rubio. And let me remind you, Pete Hague, the controversial Secretary of Defense. But in any case, for Donald Trump, whether his trip to Istanbul happens or not, this visit is expected to be quite successful, as it should strengthen the alliance between the United States and Israel, despite, let's say, certain issues, including the US's intention to recognize a Palestinian state. But ultimately, certain steps are being taken. In particular, on Monday, the Israeli hostage with US citizenship, Idan Alexander, was released, which was the result of direct negotiations between the US and the Palestinian group. Hamas, though without Israel's participation. And of course, if Trump brings back good, let's say, investment contracts from the Persian Gulf, this will also strengthen his position, at the very least. It will help bolster his standing not only in the US, but also globally. Peskov himself, in his classic style, then now we're switching to the other side, naturally started to muddy the waters, talking about how the Russian side is preparing for negotiations with Ukraine in Istanbul. He confirmed the very fact that preparations are underway. But Sisi refused to say who would be representing the Kremlin at these talks. Meanwhile, the Telegram channel Gulag.net published unconfirmed information claiming that a source close to the Federal Protective Service stated that Putin does not plan to visit Turkey. Well, that makes sense. When a head of state plans a visit to another country, certain procedures and security measures are required, which can't be arranged in just a day or two. All of this is prepared over many months, not just weeks. But there are no signs of preparations for Putin's visit to Istanbul. Again, though, this information is unconfirmed. At the same time, however, no preparations are underway for the departure of the plane that will carry Sergei Lavrov and Yuri Ushakov. Nevertheless, as Gulag.net reports, the source allowed for the possibility that in the event of some extremely unlikely personal agreement with US President Donald Trump. A decision to prepare Putin's visit could be made at any time. But as of now, as of May 15th, meetings in the Kremlin are scheduled in Putin's calendar. Let me repeat once again, the likelihood of this trip is extremely low, but it still remains. We will keep an eye on the situation in June. The picture is changing extremely rapidly, and now a few more important news items. Not of the highest priority, but nevertheless important, which nonetheless allow us to form an overall picture. Well, first of all, regarding, do you remember, there was a general called the Apocalypse, as he was enthusiastically nicknamed by Russian Z channels, General Surovikin, who for a long time even competed with Gerasimov. And he had very, let's say, strained relations with many representatives of the Russian general staff. So, General Surovikin Shashi, whom Russian Z channels portrayed as almost the reincarnation of Marshal Zhukov, who was supposed to win Putin's war of conquest against Ukraine. Of course, none of that happened. And now the former commander of the joint grouping of Russian troops in Ukraine, Army General Sergei Surovikin, the highest military rank in Russia, was spotted in a photograph from the capital of Algeria at an event dedicated to May 9th. It is reported that he is now the head of a group of Russian military specialists in Algeria. Well, that's the level. He has ended up at now. Let me remind you, his career ended completely after the Wagner PMC mutiny in June 2023. At that time, Surovikin was suspected of supporting that very Prigozhin-led mutiny. Well, thank God. He should be grateful they didn't execute him, and they could have. Well, or they fed him a newbie. Nevertheless, another Kremlin-affiliated Z Telegram channel, which is banned in Ukraine, Rybar, as reported by the Insider, well, Rybar, citing its own sources, reported that a Russian naval base under construction in the port of Sudan, romantically named Flamingo, was attacked. It is located on the coast of the Red Sea. Well, where else would it be? Of course, the new Russian military base would be situated on the coast of the Red Sea. Insider examined satellite images and confirmed that the facilities on the site where the new Russian naval base is being built show visible signs of damage. It is reported that the agreement to build a naval base in Sudan on the coast of the Red Sea was reached after negotiations that began in 2017 and concluded in 2020. The base is intended to accommodate up to 4 Russian warships and up to 300 Russian military personnel. Infrastructure is also to be established for the delivery of air defense systems, electronic warfare equipment, vehicles, tanks, and ammunition. The agreement is valid for 25 years with the possibility of extending it for another 10 years. However, the situation became more complicated. This was repeatedly reported by the Kiev Post when, in 2004, Wagner PMC fighters were attacked by Ukrainian military intelligence operatives. Footage began to appear showing drone strikes on Russian military equipment. And at that time, unconfirmed reports emerged suggesting that Ukrainian special services, specifically the Ukrainian military intelligence agency, GUR, might be behind this brilliant operation. And now, the current attack by the Rapid Response Rebel Forces on this Russian military facility raises questions about who is actually behind this attack. It's unlikely that the rebels would attack a Russian military base just on their own initiative. However, this is the very presence of Ukrainian military intelligence in Sudan has never been officially confirmed. Let me repeat once again, this is exclusively information from journalists, but it would be interesting to observe how this information develops over time. And one more piece of news now, let's call it the cherry on top. American media have reported that the 2 largest Western corporations, Boeing and Rolls-Royce, have hired lobbyists in the US Congress to push for the lifting of anti-Russian sanctions. Naturally, it all comes down to money. Boeing spent $2.6 million on lobbyists in Congress, while Rolls-Royce spent significantly less, $250,000. The point is that both companies, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, received a significant portion of the titanium they needed from Russia. Boeing, in particular, received about a third of its titanium from the Russian Federation, while Rolls-Royce received about 20%. Now, this issue is connected to the fact that the US Department of Commerce has added the Russian corporation VSMPO Avisma to the list of organizations subject to export restrictions. Now, it will become much more difficult for American corporations to purchase titanium from Russia, and so essentially it is for the sake of profits that decisions are made for these companies to seek the lifting of anti-Russian sanctions. However, whether this will actually happen or not is a big question. Friends, thank you for watching this video. Take care of yourselves and subscribe to the channel. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the armed forces, Ukrainian special forces, and territorial defense forces. As always, Major Taras Berezovets of the Ukrainian army was with you. Until next time, bye-bye.